Hello, BookTube. David Murphy and I will leave a link to his channel in case you have not encountered it, have noticed that during quarantine, the whole world is in lockdown quarantine. Most of the world is in lockdown quarantine. Everybody has tons and tons of time on their hands, and everybody, almost all of those people, especially the bookish people among them, have always said, you know, if I ever did have all the time in the world on my hands, I would read all those big books on my shelf that I just never seem to get to. I would read them all if I had that time. And now that we do, David Murphy and I have both noticed that that isn't happening. And we thought we'd give you a friendly nudge with an event that we're calling Chunksterama. And unlike most read-alongs, it does not have a prescribed ending. Because it's mainly meant to go hand in hand with quarantine. And more, especially in America, but also in the UK, more and more, there's all sorts of talk of quarantine lifting, easing, or outright lifting. And all sorts of contentious specialist voices being raised, saying that this is not how you deal with a pandemic. This is going to make things worse. You're not just flattening the curve, you're also extending it. Does everybody want to live in a plague zone forever? The way to get around that, a lot of these voices are saying, is herd immunity, and that's the only way. So we should be going to restaurants. We should send our kids to school. We should be just going out and about. As long as you are taking care to cover your mouth when you cough, to industriously wash your hands before you touch your face, that sort of thing. As long as you're doing that, some of these dissenting voices are saying you're doing as much as you can. And that anything more is just making things worse, not better. And I imagine that kind of competing experts is going to get stronger as time goes on. Pretty much everybody in the world is chafing about being locked up at home. And starting to wonder that some people out there, the libertarians, for instance, a whole bunch of other people, are starting to get more and more alarmed at how easily this was done. That people were told, stay at home, don't go outside, without any law, without any... certainly no compliance on, no agreement ahead of time on their part. If I were an autocrat in the making, I know a lot of you think I am, but if I were an autocrat in the making and I watched the events of 2020 in Europe and America, I would be very encouraged. I would have all sorts of ideas. But that's a ranty video for another day. In the meantime, David and I decided that we would make an event called Chunksterama, and that we would pull those chunksters off the shelves and walk you through them. And we decided to start with the most palatable of them all. A chunkster that a lot of you have read that is, in fact, very inviting once you get past the beginning. And that is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which we'll be doing for May. We'll be reading The Lord of the Rings in May. And this weekend, we're doing The Fellowship of the Ring, the first book. So let's prize it out of my brand new box set that I got on eBay just for this occasion. Look at how shiny and new that is. How beautiful. And this, The Lord of the Rings was conceived by Tolkien as one novel, and launched in a very inept way. I've talked about this many times, that the beginning of this book is almost intentionally designed to throw off anyone who wants to read it. It's all agriculture reports and sociological reports about hobbits. The proper story doesn't start right away. When you look at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, the prologue has several sections. The first one is concerning hobbits. But how many people that read Lord of the Rings won't have read The Hobbit and know what hobbits are? And if you don't, it can be summarized in a sentence. Instead, this goes on for page after page after page. Then the next segment is concerning pipeweed. Then on the ordering of the Shire, which is where our hobbits live. Then finally, the fourth part of the prologue is on the finding of the ring. The ring in The Hobbit that Bilbo Baggins finds, that belonged to the creature Gollum, and that when you put it on turns you invisible. A magic trinket for the children's book that is The Hobbit. And the fourth part of the prologue we get on the finding of the ring, and readers are given a very good, if a little bit long-winded, summary of that event, which is absolutely essential to understanding Lord of the Rings. You don't have to read The Hobbit to read The Lord of the Rings at all, but you have to know about the ring. And here's where we're told. And then after that fourth part, we're still in the prologue. You get 4 pages that are called Note on the Shire Records. It's all stultifyingly dull. The part about the ring isn't. It isn't dull, but it also isn't necessary. You could boil it down to 3 sentences and put it in the mouth of a character later in the book. In fact, the same stuff we've gone over later in the book. It's only when we get to chapter 1 that we get the long-expected party, where we meet Bilbo Baggins, the main character of The Hobbit, who is much older. This book takes place long after The Hobbit, and he's having his 111th birthday party. That should be the chapter 1 of the book. There should be no prologue. But anyway, we're going to talk about a couple of failings on the part of the conception here. But anyway, to continue with the plot just a little, a lot of you will be familiar with this, because if you haven't read the book, you've certainly seen Peter Jackson's movie. Bilbo's 111th birthday party is attended by, in addition to all his friends and enemies in the Shire, it's also attended by the wizard Gandalf, who is a major character in The Hobbit, who is curious about Bilbo's ring. It quickly becomes obvious, whether you know anything about the Hobbit or not, it quickly becomes obvious that the ring is going to be a fulcrum of the plot. And Bilbo has grown unhealthily attached to the thing, snaps at Gandalf about it, and wants to keep it, even though he's told himself he wants to leave it behind for his kinsman, Frodo, who's much younger than he is. And eventually, he does leave it behind. After he and Gandalf have some tense words, Bilbo goes off. He leaves the Shire because he wants to see mountains again before he dies, he says. And he wanders off, and we don't see him. We don't follow his adventures. And Gandalf leaves as well. And we're told that decades pass while Frodo grows old. While he grows, hobbits are long-lived people, and Frodo is 50. He grows to manhood as Bilbo's heir, as a wealthy, prosperous landowner in the Shire, before Gandalf returns. And when Gandalf returns, he is full of tidings. We get a chapter, Shadow in the Dark, where Gandalf and Frodo sit down and simply talk. This is where all that stuff about the finding of the ring could easily have fit in, if it didn't fit in before in conversations with Gandalf and Bilbo. None of the prologue is necessary, and I wonder how many people who might have wanted to read this book and see what all the fuss is about just were turned off completely by the prologue. I bet some. But one way or another, Gandalf tells Frodo the story of the ring, and it extends back thousands of years. Thousands of years ago, a great elfsmith created 3 great rings, elven rings. Created a whole bunch of others, too. 7 rings for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for the mortal men doomed to die. But for the elf lords, he creates 3. And they're mighty powerful rings. They're not just beautiful, but they have mystical abilities, different kinds of mystical abilities. But unbeknownst to them, while he was making them, Sauron, the villain of the piece, the bad guy who lives in the kingdom of Mordor, far to the east, is fashioning one ring to rule them all, and one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. His ring will corrupt the others, and the minute the elf lords put their rings on, they know that. They're aware of it, and so they hide their rings. Their rings were not touched by Sauron, but his ring, the one ruling ring, is a thing of immense evil. It becomes clear in the course of this trilogy that Sauron has poured a large amount of his being and power into that ring in order to make it the most powerful thing in the world. Certainly different from the playful children's trinket that we encounter in The Hobbit. And that ring passes in thousands of years ago. There's a battle. Sauron is wearing the ring, and the forces of humans and elves band together and manage to defeat him and hack the ring off his finger. And a human who's at that battle insists that it is his, that it belongs to him as a weregild for the deaths of his kinsmen. And one of the elves who is present at the time, Elrond, who is a character in this book, elves in Tolkien's mythology are immortal. They live forever unless you kill them. Elrond urges this human to destroy the ring. They're at Mount Doom. They're at the volcano on which Sauron has made his kingdom and where he forged the ring. If you throw it into that fire, it will be destroyed, and a large part of Sauron's evil will be destroyed with it. He won't just be defeated temporarily, he'll be defeated permanently. And the human refuses, because to him it is already exercising the kind of spell that we see it have on Bilbo, only much more strongly, because he refuses his comrades in arms and refuses to let it go. And he is later ambushed by orcs. The ring falls off his finger, falls into the great river Anduin, and is apparently lost to the ages. And thousands of years go by, where there might be rumors that Sauron is regaining strength and re-enlisting his Black Riders, the creatures on the cover of this box set that I bought without any justification at all. But he doesn't have his ring, and no one does. The elves still have their great rings of power, but they are hidden from Sauron. They are working their wonders in the world quietly. And when Gandalf reappears in the Fellowship of the Ring, his narration makes it clear that he has come to the conclusion that the ring that Bilbo found and gave to Frodo is the One Ring of Sauron. The most powerful thing, the most important thing in the world, certainly to know where it is, and definitely to try to destroy it. Gandalf puts it to the test. He throws it into the fireplace, and the heat doesn't affect it at all, still stays cool, but the heat is sufficient to bring out writing on the ring that the ancient records that Gandalf has consulted have told him will be on the One Ring and no other. So Gandalf now knows. The beginning of the book, Gandalf now knows that this thing is the ultimate peril of Middle-earth, the land where this whole story is set, and that something must be done about it, and that it isn't safe in the Shire. The Shire is now besieged on all sides by the Black Riders of Mordor, who have suspicions that it is there. Gandalf instructs Frodo to leave, and he does. He takes his friends Sam and Merry and Pippin, 3 other hobbits, and they head out on their way to Rivendell. They go first to a human settlement where they meet a human called Strider, who seems hale but also dangerous, and they're not completely sure about him until he reveals himself to be Aragorn, a member of in whose blood the blood of Westernesse runs true. He is the heir to the human who originally took the ring from Sauron. He is the heir to the great kingdom of men. He's been wandering in the wilderness, thwarting the enemies of men, the servants of Sauron, without any thanks at all, as he says later in the book, that he gets no thanks from anyone, including a fat man whose heart would be frozen and his blood would be boiled by enemies who live one day away from his town if he weren't ceaselessly guarded. Aragorn agrees to guide these people. The hobbits had meant to meet with Gandalf, but he doesn't show up. So Aragorn leads them to Rivendell, the home, one of the citadels of the elves of Middle-earth, and a place that is ruled over by Elrond, the elf who had been present when the ring was taken from Sauron ages ago. And there in Rivendell, Tolkien gives us one of the greatest exposition dumps of all time in all literature. It's a chapter called The Council of Elrond. Gandalf is in Rivendell. He has finally turned up, and a whole bunch of other people have too. Emissaries from all the peoples of Middle-earth have shown up. The elves, the dwarfs, the men, including a warrior man named Boromir, who is from a city right on the borders of Mordor that has been fighting Sauron with swords and shields for a long time, not just with mysticism. And he has come to Rivendell in the hopes of guidance, help of one kind or another. It doesn't cross his mind when he's making his long journey to Rivendell that he might actually be shown the One Ring. That never crosses his mind. And when he is in the Council of Elrond, when Elrond tells Frodo to bring forth the ring so that everyone can see it, Boromir, this warrior man, is among the first people to ask, well, okay, I understand it has a long and fell history. It is a dark object. It is an object of evil. But maybe it's come to us at just the right time. Shouldn't we use it? You're describing the ultimate weapon. Why should it not be ours? To use against Sauron, to defeat him. Seems like the ultimate thing and a perfect timing. He is admonished over and over again. We are admonished that the ring is totally evil. It is a thing of Sauron's. It wants to return to him, and it will turn anyone who tries to use it. The very strongest beings, mystical strength, personal strength, Aragorn, Gandalf, Elrond himself, if they put it on, the best they could hope for is that it would pervert them into merciless tyrants like Sauron. It might not make them Sauron's servants, but it would make them no better than Sauron. It's a thing you can't use. It's an ultimate weapon that can't be used. The only hope, as is made clear at the Council of Elrond, is to destroy it. Take it into the stronghold of Mordor and destroy it in the fires where it was made. And so the eponymous Fellowship of the Ring, a group of characters, a group of people, 9 people, set out to do that against all odds. They have no idea how they will succeed. Aragorn goes along, of course. The 4 hobbits do. Gandalf, of course, will guide the group. And also Legolas, an elf, and Gimli, a dwarf, and Boromir. They all set out from Rivendell on the quest to bring the ring to Mordor and destroy it. This is the bulk of the book. The Fellowship almost immediately comes to grief. And in a chapter set in the mines of Moria, an underground dwarf city, Gandalf appears to fall to his death in battle with a mystic being called a Balrog. And the Fellowship is absolutely bereft. They have no idea what to do. They end up in another elf stronghold, Lothlorien, which is ruled over by Lady Galadriel and her husband, and Lady Galadriel is wearing another one of the elf rings. So 2 are now accounted for. And our crew, takes stock there, but they eventually decide they have to leave, and then tragedy strikes, and a gigantic orc war party intercepts them, and Frodo and Sam are driven away. Frodo realizes that if I'm with these people and I have this ring, I'm a danger to all my friends. If this quest is going to happen, if somebody's going to take this ring to Mordor, it has to be me alone. It can't be them. They don't have any more of a chance than I do, and they will die if I'm with them. So he sets off, and his friend Sam goes with him. But the 2 other hobbits, Merry and Pippin, are taken by this company of orcs. And the Fellowship is in complete disarray. And that's how the book ends. That's how the Fellowship of the Ring ends, because it is not meant to be one book. That is not meant to be a cliffhanger ending. This is just 1/3 of the whole book that is The Lord of the Rings. That's what Tolkien intended, and that's what goes on from here. And that explains the chapter numberings and the headings, the section headings. People that kind of encounter this for the first time always have a little bit of confusion about that, because the next thing we're going to be reading for next weekend, The Two Towers, doesn't start with chapter 1. It's in the middle of a book. But that is the Fellowship of the Ring, and in way of discussion for a read-along, I wanted to raise a couple of points. I have raised many points. I love this book dearly. Absolutely. I love the Lord of the Rings as a book dearly. Just dearly. I reread it so many times. But I do raise questions about it. I like to poke fun at it. I like to poke it in the ribs from time to time. I won't raise any of the plot problems that I have, although I have plenty of plot problems. I will raise some questions here about Tolkien himself. And whether or not the fictional world that he presents to us in this book makes a whole lot of sense. Does it make a whole lot of sense? For instance, not to dwell on it too much, but Elrond and Círdan the Shipwright and a bunch of other elves, high elves, and a bunch of other humans are alive when Sauron is defeated the first time. And this human, Aragorn's ancestor, is holding the One Ring. And unlike in the Fellowship of the Ring, everyone at that moment knows what the One Ring is. They all know that if it is destroyed, right there where they are, this battle takes place at Mount Doom. If it's destroyed, they all know that their labors will not have been in vain, that Sauron will not return. And the human who has it wants to keep it. Tolkien makes no mention of that human being surrounded by his own warriors with their bows pointed out. It seems to be just his decision. No, I don't want to destroy it, I want to keep it. In the terms that this book sets out, it's lunacy to think that the elves and men present wouldn't simply have overpowered him, or killed him, and taken the ring, and destroyed it. It's lunacy to think that. It might be true that they might have decided to let him have it and keep it as a weregild if they didn't know what it was. But they do know what it is. They know better than anybody what it is. It makes no sense at all that, for instance, Elrond, who was present at the time, wouldn't have taken the ring and thrown it in the fire. It makes no sense at all that would have happened. And along the same lines, it also doesn't make any sense that Gandalf needs decades to deal with this thing. Decades. I mean, it's one thing if maybe he didn't know what Bilbo found when Bilbo found it 70 years ago. It's a very different thing. When we first meet Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring, he's had a long time to think about this. His suspicions are aroused. He knows it's not just a simple magic ring. And he still leaves it, with Bilbo, in an envelope on the mantelpiece in the Shire. For decades. That makes no sense at all. None. He should have returned in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. Maybe a year, but decades? It sits there for decades. This thing that he knows. It raises a question with me about the lengths to which Tolkien had to go to keep this plot working. Obviously, there is no book if Elrond destroys the ring 2,000 years before the Fellowship of the Ring. And there's likewise a very different book if Gandalf returns to the Shire and has this adventure to destroy it with Bilbo instead of Frodo. And I'm not 100% sure why that doesn't happen. From a writing point. I'm not talking for the minute now internally about the story. I'm thinking about Tolkien. I'm wondering what you think. Especially those of you who have read this. What kind of a book would that have been? if the quest had been Bilbo and other people. I mean, Frodo and Merry and Pippin would all have been either not born or much too young to go on that quest. So what would have happened? Would it have been Gandalf and Bilbo who made their way to Rivendell? There would have been no Black Riders. No one would have suspected anything at the time. So there wouldn't have been any resistance to get to Rivendell. They wouldn't have needed a whole bunch of people and Aragorn's help. Where was Aragorn at the time? Would there have been necessary to have emissaries from the dwarves and the elves? I don't know. It would have been a completely different book, of course, but when I reread this book, and I was happy to reread it for this readathon, I immediately start questioning things like that. I immediately start wondering, why did Gandalf need so incredibly long to return to the Shire and deal with the matter of this ring? Tolkien himself raises a possibility, as we're going to see in the next book. There are other wizards in Middle-earth, not just Gandalf, and one of them is, as he calls it, the head of my order, Saruman. And Saruman's particular power is his ability to convince. His voice causes people to do things that he wants them to do, even though their intellect might tell them otherwise. We see examples of this many times, all the way to the end of the book. It's possible that worked on Gandalf. Saruman, as we'll see in the next book, next weekend, has other ideas about the ring than Gandalf does, and we're told that he assures the Council of the Wisest that the ring is lost forever, that it fell into the Anduin River and will never be found again, rolled down to the sea, and will be there forever. It's possible that is the explanation. I find it hard to believe that explanation would hold true for decades. But one way or another, I want to know what you thought, especially if you're reading this for the first time, or have read it only recently for the first time. I can't remember off the top of my head if David Murphy has ever read this. So we'll see what he thinks. We'll see what he makes of it all. But anyway, that is your very first installment of Chunksterama, is the Fellowship of the Ring. We're reading the Lord of the Rings. So next weekend, we're going to do the Two Towers in my beautiful new box set that I bought. Again, for no justification at all. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is your Chunksterama to help you get through the Lord of the Rings for once. Or maybe some of you, like me, for the 100th time. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.